There is a pattern in history that most people misread. They see a charismatic general seize control of a failing republic, and they call it a personality story. They see a party consolidate media, judiciary, and military under a single executive, and they call it a political story. They see a population hand over its freedoms to a man who promises stability, and they call it a psychology story. Mass delusion, collective trauma, the madness of crowds. Historians write about the rhetoric. Political scientists write about the institutions. Psychologists write about the anxiety. And they are all describing real things. But they are all, in a very precise sense, describing the wrong layer of the problem. Because beneath every strong man, beneath every authoritarian consolidation in the modern era, there is a balance sheet. There is a central bank. There is a printing press. And printing press always comes first. This is not a fringe observation. It is not conspiratorial. It is, if you look at the actual sequence of events, one of the most consistent patterns in modern political history, and one of the least discussed. We spend enormous intellectual energy analyzing the faces of authoritarianism. We write books about Hitler's psychology, Stalin's paranoia, Mussolini's theatrics, Chavez's charisma, Erdogan's cunning. And these things matter. But they are downstream of something more structural, something more patient, something that does not need a face at all until the damage is already done. The question worth asking, the question that almost nobody is asking, is not what kind of man becomes a strong man. The question is what kind of monetary system creates the conditions in which a strong man becomes inevitable. Let's start with a thinker who understood power at a level that most political philosophers never reached. Not because he was an economist, he wasn't, but because he was one of the few philosophers of the 20th century willing to look at power without flinching, without romanticizing it, without assuming it was always worn openly on the sleeve. Michel Foucault spent his career mapping what he called the microphysics of power, the idea that power is not primarily a thing that governments hold and citizens lack. Power, in Foucault's framework, is a relationship. It circulates. It flows through institutions, through language, through norms, through the invisible architecture of daily life. He was fascinated by the ways in which people are governed without ever experiencing a direct command. The way systems shape behavior before behavior ever needs to be corrected. The way control embeds itself in what feels like freedom. In his lectures at the Collège de France, particularly the ones gathered under the title The Birth of Biopolitics, Foucault turned his attention to something he had largely avoided earlier in his career: economics. And specifically, he began examining the relationship between economic rationality and political governance. What he called governmentality, the art of conducting the conduct of populations, had, he argued, become increasingly economic in its logic. The modern state does not rule primarily through law. It rules through the management of economic life, through the shaping of incentives, through the calibration of risk and reward, through the construction of an economic subject, a person who understands themselves, above all, as a rational economic actor operating within a system whose rules they did not write. Foucault was not writing about money directly. He was not writing about central banking. But the framework he built is extraordinarily precise in what it illuminates. Because if power flows through economic rationality, if the conduct of populations is governed through the management of economic conditions, then whoever controls the fundamental parameters of economic life holds a qualitatively different kind of power than any traditional political authority. Not the power to command, something more intimate, the power to set the terms in which every choice is made. And in the modern world, the most fundamental parameter of economic life, the one that underlies every price, every wage, every debt, every saving, every calculation about the future, is the money supply. Whoever controls the money supply does not need to issue commands. They shape the terrain in which all other decisions occur. They determine, at the most basic level, who can accumulate capital and who cannot. They determine the real value of savings versus the real cost of debt. They determine which sectors of the economy are floated and which are allowed to sink. They determine, and this is the part that rarely gets said plainly, which concentrations of power are possible and which are not. This is what Foucault was circling around without quite reaching. Not because he wasn't brilliant enough, but because the monetary system was simply not his subject. It was the water he swam in, as it is for almost everyone. You do not notice the infrastructure of power when it presents itself as the neutral background of reality. Let's make the mechanism more concrete, because this is not abstract. When a government can issue currency at will, when there is no hard constraint on monetary expansion, it acquires a capability that no pre-modern state possessed in quite the same form. It can fund itself without taxing. This sounds like a technical detail. It is not. It is one of the most politically transformative developments in human history, and it happened so gradually and was dressed up in so much technical language that most people never registered the moment it occurred. Taxation is visible. It requires legislation. It requires a named extraction from named people. It provokes resistance. Democratic systems evolved in large part as mechanisms for constraining the state's ability to tax. The idea that a government derives its power from the consent of the governed is, historically, almost inseparable from the idea that the governed must agree to fund the government. No taxation without representation is not primarily a philosophical statement. It is a recognition that fiscal constraint is political constraint. If the king must come to Parliament to fund his army, Parliament has leverage. Inflation has no such visibility. When a government expands the money supply, it does not send a tax bill. The value of existing money simply declines, quietly, gradually, diffused across millions of transactions, experienced as rising prices rather than as a named extraction. The mechanism is real. The wealth transfer is real. But the political feedback loop, the anger, the accountability, the resistance, is blunted, deferred, confused. People feel poorer. They often blame merchants, or foreigners, or immigrants, or abstract forces. They rarely trace the trajectory back to the source with enough clarity and confidence to act on it politically. This is not an accident. This is the design. And here is where the structural logic of authoritarian consolidation begins to emerge. Not as a political accident, not as the product of one unusual demagogue, but as a predictable consequence of what fiat monetary systems make possible. When you can fund the state through monetary expansion rather than taxation, you remove the primary historical check on state accumulation of resources. You allow governments, and the institutional networks around governments, the contractors, the banks, the favored industries, to grow at a rate that bears no relationship to what the population has actually consented to fund. The state's share of the economy can expand in ways that would be politically impossible if every dollar had to be visibly extracted from a visible taxpayer. And as the state's share of the economy grows, the private sector's relative independence shrinks. Not because of any single law or command, but because more and more economic activity is either directly funded by the state, dependent on state contracts, regulated by state agencies, or vulnerable to state-controlled credit conditions. The texture of economic life becomes, slowly, structurally, more dependent on political favor. And dependence on political favor is not compatible with the kind of distributed, independent economic power that a genuinely pluralistic society requires. The historian Rob Higgs documented this process across American history under what he called the Ratchet effect, the observation that crises expand the state, and the state never fully contracts when the crisis passes. Each emergency, war, depression, pandemic, is funded through monetary expansion and deficit spending. Each emergency leaves behind a larger institutional apparatus. Each expansion of the apparatus requires its own justification, its own constituency, its own permanent staff of people whose livelihoods depend on its continuation. The ratchet clicks forward. It does not click back. This is not a story about malevolent conspirators, though malevolent actors certainly learn to exploit the system. This is a story about structural incentives. When the monetary system permits unlimited self-funding by the state will expand. Not because every politician is corrupt, but because the incentive structure makes expansion the path of least resistance, and contraction politically costly in ways that expansion never is. Now hold that observation and extend it. Because the ratchet effect Higgs documented in a relatively stable democracy is not the final destination of this logic. It is the mild version. The early chapter. The final destination. The place where the structural logic of fiat monetary concentration arrives. when it operates without the friction of strong institutions, independent courts, functioning press, and genuine political competition, is not the administrative state. It is not the bloated welfare apparatus. It is not even the crony capitalist network of connected insiders feeding at the public trough, though that is always present, always accelerating. The final destination is a face. A single face on whose authority the entire apparatus of monetary and political power converges. Because once economic power is sufficiently concentrated, it requires a single point of decision. It requires someone to determine who receives the credit and who does not, which industries survive and which collapse, which populations are protected by monetary policy and which are sacrificed to it. Distributed economic power can be governed by rules. Concentrated economic power must be governed by a person. The logic does not require the person to be a monster, though the logic certainly does not prevent it. It only requires that the person be the person, the singular authority at the center of a monetary and political apparatus that has grown too large, too intertwined, and too powerful to be governed any other way. The strong man does not arrive because a civilization runs out of good men. The strong man arrives because the monetary system has made his arrival structurally rational. This is the sentence that changes how you read history. Not as a parade of great men and villains, not as a sequence of ideological contests, not as the triumph or failure of particular cultures or religions or ethnic temperaments, but as a recurring collision between monetary architecture and political possibility. The monetary architecture sets the space of what is possible. The politics fills it. And here is the deeply uncomfortable corollary. If that is true, then reforming the politics without reforming the monetary architecture is not a solution. It is rearranging the furniture inside a structure whose load-bearing walls are still intact. You can vote out the strong man. You can write a new constitution. You can hold tribunals and establish truth commissions and build memorials and teach the history in schools so it never happens again. And all of those things have value. But if the printing press remains, if the fundamental capability of unlimited self-funding by the state remains structurally intact, then you have not addressed the condition. You have addressed the symptom. The next face is already somewhere in the system, learning its logic, waiting for the next crisis to complete the ratchet's next click. This is not pessimism. This is diagnosis. And diagnosis is the precondition for cure. Bitcoin is the cure. I want to say that plainly, without the hedging and the throat clearing that often surrounds this claim in polite intellectual company. Not as a price prediction, not as an investment thesis, as a structural argument about the relationship between monetary architecture and political freedom. Bitcoin is the first monetary system in human history that removes the printing press from the equation. Not through political will, not through the personal virtue of central bankers, not through the design of independent institutions that are always, in the end, one crisis or one appointment away from capture, but through mathematics, through the protocol itself, through a set of rules that no government authorized and no government can override, enforced not by a court or a constitution, but by a decentralized network of participants whose collective interest is in the integrity of the rules. The 21 million cap is not a policy. It is not a target. It is not even a promise in the conventional sense, because a promise implies a promiser who could choose otherwise. It is a mathematical constraint embedded in the only monetary system ever designed to be genuinely ungovernable by any single actor. When we explored the philosophy of 21 million in episode 5, we talked about it as the first monetary promise enforced by mathematics rather than by trust. Here, in the context of power and its concentration, we can say something more precise. It is the first monetary architecture that structurally prevents the mechanism through which concentrated power becomes inevitable. Think about what Foucault's framework actually requires for the kind of power he was describing, the power that shapes the terrain of choice rather than issuing commands. It requires control of the parameters. It requires the ability to set the terms in which economic life is conducted. It requires, at the foundation, the ability to expand or contract the supply of the medium through which all economic calculation occurs. Take that away, not through goodwill, not through law, but through the physics of the system itself, and the entire architecture of monetary governmentality collapses. Not immediately, not without transition, but structurally, irreversibly. A state that cannot print, cannot silently tax. A state that cannot silently tax must visibly tax. A state that must visibly tax must justify each extraction to those it extracts from. The political feedback loop, accountability, resistance, the leverage of the governed over the government, is restored. Not perfectly, not automatically, but structurally. Because the constraint is real, and the constraint is in the protocol, and nobody, no central banker, no emergency cabinet, no wartime authority, no international institution with a three-letter acronym has a key to unlock it. This is what makes Bitcoin categorically different from every previous attempt at monetary reform. Every gold standard was enforced by institutions that ultimately held the gold. Every commodity peg was maintained by a central authority that ultimately decided when the peg was no longer convenient. Every independent central bank was independent only to the degree that the political system tolerated its independence, and political systems, under sufficient pressure, have proven remarkably consistent in their tolerance levels. The institutional solution to monetary corruption is always, in the end, another institution, another set of humans, another set of incentives, another vulnerability to the same structural pressures that corrupted the previous arrangement. Bitcoin is not an institution, it is a protocol, and the difference between an institution and a protocol is not technical, it is civilizational. An institution can be pressured, captured, reformed, dissolved, or simply redefined by sufficiently concentrated power. A protocol, once running on a sufficiently decentralized network, cannot. Not because it is hidden, not because it has powerful defenders, but because there is no single point at which concentrated power can apply its leverage. Foucault, near the end of his career, became increasingly interested in what he called technologies of the self, the practices through which individuals constitute themselves as subjects, as agents, as people with a particular relationship to their own freedom. He was interested in how you escape the structures that govern you, not by overthrowing them, but by developing the internal capacity to relate to yourself and your life outside their terms. It is a compelling idea, but it has a limit, because individual self-constitution, however admirable, does not change the structural incentives of a monetary system. You can be a perfectly sovereign individual in your own consciousness and still have your savings inflated away. You can think outside every fiat category and still be subject to the credit conditions that the fiat system sets. Inner freedom is real and valuable, but it does not fix the balance sheet. It does not remove the printing press. What Bitcoin offers is something Foucault's framework never quite found room for: a technology of structural freedom, not a philosophy of resistance, not a practice of self-constitution, an actual, working, mathematical architecture that makes the central mechanism of modern political control inoperable, not for one person, not for one community, but for anyone who chooses to use it. Everywhere. Simultaneously. Without permission. Without a central authority that can be captured. Without a face. This is why the phrase that opens this episode, "The strongman always arrives with a printing press," is not a historical curiosity. It is a design specification for what a free monetary system must prevent. And the specification, for the first time in human history, has been met. I want to close with something that sits at the edge of what most monetary analysis is willing to say. We are living, right now, in a period of global authoritarian consolidation. Not identical in every country, not at the same stage everywhere, but the pattern is unmistakable if you are looking at the right layer. Across geographies, across cultures, across ideological traditions that appear to be opposites, power is concentrating. Institutions that were designed to distribute and constrain power are weakening. The individuals and communities and businesses that exist outside the protected networks of state-adjacent capital are finding themselves increasingly subject to conditions they did not choose and cannot escape through ordinary political action. Most of the analysis of this moment focuses on the political layer, on the personalities, on the rhetoric, on the failures of liberal institutions to make their case. And again, these observations are real, but they are the wrong layer. The strongman is not the cause. The monetary system is the cause. The strongman is what the monetary system eventually produces, the way a particular soil, given sufficient time and the right conditions, reliably produces a particular plant. We can keep pulling up the plants, or we can change the soil. Bitcoin changes the soil. It does not do this by electing better people. It does not do this by designing smarter institutions. It does not do this by making a more persuasive argument. It does this by making the printing press, the mechanism through which economic power concentrates until it requires a face, structurally obsolete. Not for everyone at once, not overnight, but irreversibly, for everyone who chooses it, at a rate that the system cannot stop because there is no single point at which the system can apply its force. The strongman always arrives with a printing press, but the printing press only works if the money it produces is the only money that matters. The moment that changes, the moment a credible alternative exists, one that cannot be inflated, cannot be seized at the protocol level, cannot be weaponized by whoever controls the apparatus, the logic that made the strongman inevitable begins to unwind. We are at the beginning of that unwinding, not the end, not the victory lap. The beginning, the hard, uncertain, consequential beginning of the first serious structural challenge to the monetary architecture that has made authoritarian consolidation the default trajectory of modern civilization. That is what this channel is about. Not the price of a coin, not the quarterly returns of a new asset class, not the technology of a faster payment rail, but the civilizational question underneath all of those things. What kind of world does concentrated monetary power produce, and what kind of world becomes possible when that concentration is structurally prevented? History has given us a very clear answer to the first question. We are living it. Bitcoin is the argument for what comes next. This is not a channel about price. It is a channel about civilization. Subscribe.